All right, let's stay with this story and speak to risk analyst and former diplomat, Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, who joins us live now. Dr. Makhubela, thank you so much for your time and good evening to you. Listening to the Tanzanian president there, Samia Suluhu Hassan, saying that China has been a true partner in fighting poverty and ensuring that there's infrastructure development around the continent, among the many other, projects that they've embarked upon. I wonder what was your take on some of what you've heard there from some of the African leaders?
Mongwe, thank you very much. Always a pleasure to join you. China has invested a lot in terms of infrastructure development in the continent, be it railway infrastructure, road infrastructure in the DRC, even institutional infrastructure such as the meeting. They just completed building a conference center in Zimbabwe recently. So there's been a great deal of investment in terms of the infrastructure in the continent, no doubt about it. But what is required moving forward, Bongiwe, if you look at the 10 points that have been presented by China, one of those 10 points speaks about investment in really industrializing the African continent and so on. But what is required, it's a commitment from African states to commit their resources to.
And that's exactly the big question, because when I was in conversation with someone who's been watching this development, over throughout this week, they were saying that if Africa does not have a coordinated response and even understand that as a continent, it needs to put its resources in the right places, where you're getting these commitments need to translate to jobs. It needs to translate to, some of the critical conversations that must be had about infrastructure development, for example. So I'm hearing you say that this coordinated approach is something that is much needed.
It's indeed needed. The challenge, of course, has been the investment from the continent. Yeah, there's no financial commitment from the continent, particularly around the administrative issues, good governance issues. The Chinese have borrowed a lot of money to countries such as Zambia. They are now lending a lot of money to us. And this money should not go to social grants and so on. Should be recapitalized in terms of the infrastructure and the development. We have to meet the Chinese halfway. The expectation that China would provide everything, it's misplaced. But look at the 10 points that China is presenting. It's quite comprehensive. And two issues coming out of that, Bonge, that is going to create challenges for a lot of countries. It's around the military cooperation between China and the African countries, because they are making it. The Chinese have made a commitment that they will do joint military maneuvers, exercises with African countries. They will train African countries and military people, which is, of course, there's the training that is required. But it's going to send the message that the Chinese actually, because of the geopolitical rivalries, it's going to play itself out. The bigger issue here is what the Chinese have described as the new era. The Secretary General just spoke about a new institution that speaks to today's dynamics. Today's dynamics are such that the power has evolved so much. There's no longer a unipolar world. There are a lot of polarities that are starting to emerge, and they need to be harnessed. It's Africa really coordinating in terms of exercising its power. This power may be in terms of the numbers, the resources that we have. Are we coordinating? The answer is no, we are not.
Elaborate, especially when it comes to, the reaction from those who could be leaning more towards the West, and how they're likely to view this 10-point plan, because it's not only about that military drills, but also the commitment of around $50 billion and also the promise of jobs and all of that. How are they likely to be viewing this one?
Last week, the National Security Advisor of the U.S. was in China. And he had a meeting with the foreign minister and President Xi Jinping. And I think some of the challenges that they are raising, that Americans are having, it's around this question of the cooperation between Africa and China. And, the Americans presented a document about 2 years ago when Secretary of State was here and the Treasurer Secretary was here. This strategic approach towards Southern Africa, it speaks about maligning China and Russia. And you can see that rivalry playing itself And because the financial institutions in the continent are still linked to the dollar, you're going to find the Americans using their power in terms of blackmailing small countries and coercing them. Because Americans' diplomacy has really focused too much on coercive force instead of really soft diplomacy part of it, which they've lost in terms of influencing African countries.
I was, of course, watching some of the conversations that are coming out of this one. You think about our agricultural minister, for example, John Steenhuisen, saying that, South Africa is benefiting a lot more out of this particular relationship than we are losing. But there are others who are saying that for the African continent here, this may not be exactly a mutually beneficial relationship. Others are describing it as a debt trap, but others are saying it's an investment.
Well, any financial lending that comes from China, it must serve the Chinese and it must serve the African continent. The Chinese, of course, they expect some return on their investment, like anyone else. And we expect to utilize that resources much better. I think Africa is going to benefit. One thing that the Chinese are not coming up with is the political conditionalities, which are part of the Washington consensus, in terms of downgrading your public service, reducing the number of the public service, and coming up with certain reforms, including nationalization and so on. The Chinese are not coming up with that. So the Chinese, they need some level of collateral. We've seen collateral in terms of what they are doing in countries like Zambia and so on. This is what the Chinese are going to do. They're going to keep on really raising some collateral for their own benefit. To expect the Chinese not to come up with some collateral to protect their investment, it would be naive.
So I suppose back to your earlier point, it's now time to, reinvigorate the economy of the continent, and not only leaders who are concentrating on winning the elections, I suppose.
I mean, the Chinese are talking about creating jobs, dealing with the question of poverty in the continent, reindustrializing the continent. So these are words that resonate with a lot of African countries, what they want to do. The issue is a commitment that we need to see from the African countries in terms of planning better utilization of resources, for dealing with the infrastructure development that the Chinese are envisaging.
All right, it's going to be an interesting one to see then what happens when everyone returns home and it's now time for implementation. Thank you so much as always. I appreciate your time. That is risk analyst and former diplomat, Dr. Kingsley Makhubela.